Hello and welcome to Sea Views. I'm Julia Gosling and I'm here with my co-host Adam Parnell. Hello, Adam.
Hi, how are you doing, Julia? All right?
Yes, very well, thank you. So today we have some more content on offshore industry and linked to the diving world. And we've interestingly recently recorded an episode on unmanned surface vessels. And now today we're going to actually look at remote operated vehicles. So if you like, the subsea part of the world, aren't we? So welcome to Andy Howie. Andy's founder of Pioneer Subsea. You're an ex-naval submariner. And you've got years of experience in the offshore industry. Now you specialize in remote operated vehicle operations. So thanks so much for joining.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Yeah. Maybe we should set the scene a bit. Remote operated vehicles. I mean, can you give us a bit of a definition and why they're such an important part of the maritime world now?
I mean, the big things with remotely operated vehicles is they can go deep. You know, the commercial diving, the saturation divers, there's only a limit as to how deep they can go. So the ROVs, these days with, the increase in technology and whatnot, people are drilling deeper, they're going deeper. There's laying of subsea cables for, all your internet and your data and everything. So they need to be able to go to the bottom of the ocean. And ROVs can do nearly everything a diver can, but they can just go deeper. I mean, you're not going to get the full intricacies of, fingertip stuff, but all they do is they design new equipment so that an ROV can operate it and can integrate and, intervent with it, and they throw it down the seabed and an ROV will put it. So I've done some work down to 6,000 meters. I've done work at 8 meters. So it's not just so much for the deep. You've got the high tidal areas around the UK and the North Sea, the Channel, where a diver potentially would struggle, 2-knot current, an ROV can go in that. So it's all about more power and deeper, which is why ROVs are used. And as I said, they've pretty much done everything you can imagine subsea, from, doing surveys. That's the kind of bread and butter of an ROV survey, to kind of construction of oil fields, helping with the kind of suction for the wind farms, UXO detection, and then other uses such as salvage. There's a lot of vessels that kind of sink when they're leaking oil, fuel, etc. ROVs will go down there and plug the holes and do the surveys. So what an ROV can do, that the sky's the limit, really. Well, the seabed's the limit, I suppose, right? Realistically, yeah. The seabed's the limit, and they're always going deeper. And as the kind of the technology advances, the kind of the capabilities of the ROV will always increase.
And it seems like it's taking the human out of the danger zone.
To a certain extent, yes. There are systems where there can be somebody inside. You've got all these the really expensive, fancy glass bubbles that people sit in and go down, but they don't go to the same depth like an ROV would. You've still got the people inside, and there are all these adventure seekers, was it James Cameron, the film director? He went down to the Challenger Deep. He was in a little kind of pod. I think he's one of only 3 people that have ever gone to the absolute bottom of the ocean. So there are people that can do it, but why would you? The worst and I've never been diving, but I can't imagine, being a saturation diver, being down at, 150 meters. And then, I've been in a submarine, but, you're in a big tube, there's lots of safety and measures and that. But, sat diver, just being in a suit, going down to 150 meters. No, thank you.
No.
Getting wet, cold, dark. Yeah, I'd rather be sat up on the vessel operating.
Yes, keeping dry.
Yeah, usually.
And one of the things I've got, Andy, you mentioned UXO and exploded ordnance and other things. We've talked about the danger zone. When we talk about zones, you said between 8 and 6,000 meters you've sort of worked between, and I'm sure they go beyond that as well. Where's the bread and butter work sort of conducted? Is there a sort of a typical depth or a sort of more common depth that these operate at, or is it really just anywhere?
I mean, with the North Sea, I think the deepest point in the North Sea is probably 150, 200 meters. And there are points where, there are big trenches where they are below 1,000 meters, but most of the work with the North Sea oil and gas is under 150 meters, which is why there's a high amount of sat diving and diving done in the North Sea. But outside of the North Sea, bread and butter work's usually done anywhere between 100 meters to about 3,000. Most systems that are commercially available from your big producers are usually rated to about 3,000 meters. Anything that's what you want to go deeper than that is usually there's a specific reason why they wanted to go deeper. So the likes of, your kind of scientific and research people, they're going all over the shop. I've got a colleague of mine who he's doing a lot of scientific research on the vessel he works with, and he's going down to 6,000 meters quite regularly, doing samples, doing, visuals on weird or wonderful sea life. And then there's the salvage option as well, because, that there's no guarantee that something's going to sink in a nice, accessible 1,000 meter. It could, if it's doing an Atlantic crossing, it could be down to 6,000 meters. So yeah, the bread and butter I'd say is less than 3,000. That's where most of the work is done. But there is an increase in the desire to have systems that will go deeper.
And I'm assuming we're not talking, these things aren't just sort of torpedo-like, just like tubes, are they? So these will have, I guess, accessories and arms and things, or some sort of sensors on the outside?
I mean, your torpedo type ones are designed for kind of surveys. That would be more your AUV, so your autonomous underwater vehicle. So an ROV is remotely operated, but is still run by a cable. So you still have power and data connected to it, and it's connected and controlled from the surface. Whereas with an AUV, which is more of your torpedo type ones, they are battery operated and basically just released and forgotten, maybe not forgotten about, but they go off, do their little mission, and then they're recollected, charged up, sent back again. But with an ROV, imagine something as small as, kind of like a laptop case, a briefcase, something as small as that, maybe even smaller for a proper work class ROV, something the size of a transit van.
Well,
and with the, they'll look, very blocky, big rectangle, and they'll have, high voltage going down there, 3,500, 4,000 volts. They'll have hydraulic systems on there up to, 200, 300 bar. And they'll have the robotic arms that, everybody gets fascinated about.
Yes. These sound expensive. What are some of these worth? These?
Several million plus for a full system. For a small eyeball system, I would imagine probably anywhere between 100, 200,000 pounds. For the bigger world-class systems, between 2.5, 5 million, depending on your setup.
Yeah, so you want some good drivers. Yes. Yeah. I'm fascinated to think what does it look like for the people that are operating these vehicles? They're sitting on a ship. What's the day-to-day work? How does it happen? What does it look like?
Depending on the project, if you're doing a survey project, or once you've kind of mobilized the systems, you'd be putting on all your survey sensors, like your multi-beams, your echo sounders, your depth, perhaps a metal detector on the back, for want of a better phrase. So once you've got all that set up, it's very much, if everything's working well, you're sat looking at a screen for 12 hours. There'll be about a couple of people on your shift, and you'll be rotating, and you'll just be following a screen.
Okay, do you see?
Following this screen. Not always, depending on the setup on the system. If it's a big work class and it's actually designed to be built into the vessel, you'll have a nice little control room, usually down near where the ROV will be launched from. A lot of systems are built into containers, so it will just be put on the back deck. So you'll be sat in a container for 12 hours. But yeah, it depends on the project and the setup on the vessel, really. A lot of the smaller type inspection class, they tend to be on vessels of opportunity for short jobs. So they tend to be containerized and they're just lifted on and off. But yeah, day to day, if everything's going well, you're cozy, you're warm, you're comfortable. If everything's not going well, you're usually cold, depending on where you're working. If it's North Sea, you're usually cold, wet, and covered in oil, or, you're manhandled into a small space trying to unscrew something. So yeah, it's kind of swings and roundabouts as to how much luxury you've got.
And we'll sort of, I suppose, if we're talking about the people that are operating them, let's start with how do you even get into this industry? I mean, I guess for you, but it sounds like it's a natural shift from being a submariner to being, so rather than being in a machine that goes underwater, being in control of the machine that goes underwater. But I mean, is that the case? Is that typical?
Yeah, there are a lot of ex-forces that do work offshore. With regards to the RV side of things, it tends to be somebody who has gained vocational experience within a technical discipline and has then looked for a change and managed to kind of get into a trainee position within one of the big operators. That's what happened to me. I left the Navy and managed to apply to Fugro, and they took me on as a trainee and put me through all my training. There are other avenues to get in. There are a lot of training providers that provide courses for ROVs, so people who want to learn how to do the basics of an ROV, get an introduction, they get to get some piloting hours. However, going into as a recruiter, the people that do those courses, they still don't have the relevant operational and project experience to be utilized as a contractor. They still really need to be going through a trainee position within a company to get a staff job. So, a lot of the guys that work offshore, as I say, they're ex-forces, so ex-Navy, Army, RAF. There are a lot of RAF people for some reason within the offshore industry, but a lot of them have done some sort of kind of trade. So they're, maybe not like, your plumbers, your electricians, but they've either worked in a car manufacturing factory. So they've worked a lot with PLCs and electronics. They've worked, car mechanics is another big one, because they've been working with engines, hydraulics, again, electronics. Yeah. With the way that the industry is going just now, where there's a lot more computer-based stuff, you're getting a lot more people who have got electronics and computing-based kind of backgrounds coming in, but you still need your hydraulics, your mechanics, because even though the ROV is predominantly electronic, the launch system and everything else to get the ROV in the water does tend to be very much kind of big rams, big motors, big pumps. So you still need that kind of that background as well.
That's a really good point you've raised out. It's a team endeavor. This isn't, but I suppose, and I've been guilty of this. If you said to me, you talk about, an ROV or an AUV operator, I would immediately think about the person sat at some sort of console with a joystick or some form of sort of computer control, sort of to sort of common language, the driver. But actually, that's really one of the many roles that I guess there are in this field.
Yeah, the piloting side of it is a very, I'd say, small part of what you do, because if you don't know how to fix it, piloting it is, it isn't going to help you. I mean, we have worked on teams. I mean, it's good to have a good mix. So I've worked on teams where a guy's not been that technically strong, but he's a great pilot. Whereas the other, in the big work class systems where you have usually a minimum of 3 guys working with you, if you've got one guy who's not technically great, but he's a great pilot, and the other 2 are technically great, then the team's going to work. Yeah. So it's all about team dynamics. But yeah, the piloting side of things, I mean, they say that anybody can train to be a pilot. That's not strictly true. I've worked with guys who've been doing it for 20 years, and you're very much a case of you're lucky you're a good tech. Because if you weren't a good tech, then you wouldn't be working offshore because you're a shocking pilot. But the piloting side of it is I would say it's probably the least important part of being in ROV. You need to be able to fix it. However, that's all changing these days with the introduction of the remote operating centers that a lot of providers are coming in with, where the ROV pilot is never likely to see the ROV.
So could they be onshore even?
Yeah, they'll be working entirely onshore. So they'll be hired entirely to just be a pilot. I'd imagine that through the training courses and everything that they'll do to become a pilot, they'll have a basic introduction as to how the ROV operates, but they won't be the one fixing it if something goes wrong. They'll just be piloting it. So, the way that the dynamics is going to change, that the piloting is going to be entirely done by a pilot, and then the maintenance will be done entirely by the technicians. And, unless there's any issues with kind of the network data, the technicians is unlikely to fly it, and the pilot's unlikely to fix it. Yeah.
So that's technology changing the way that it operates, because it simply wasn't possible before.
Yeah, with the internet connection to offshore vessels, when I first started, it was, shocking. You'd come on shift, you'd log into the computer, and then you'd hit kind of log in for your email, and then you'd come back in your coffee break an hour later to see what emails you've got in. And then, but you would then see what email you got in, and then you would write the reply on Word and then cut and paste ready for the end of shift when you then send it. So it wasn't great. But these days with, Starlink and all the rest of the stuff, that, there's guys offshore now that are able to kind of stream Netflix and watch stuff in their bunk and all that. And then when it comes to the remote operations, they've actually got that bandwidth to be able to transmit data, video, and then control ROVs remotely from centers. I mean, I've seen it with one of the kind of companies I'm working with. I've seen them operating an ROV remotely in the North Sea, which is great. I don't know to kind of what extent they're doing stuff. I think it's mostly survey at the moment over the kind of the satellite comms, but the possibilities are endless because realistically the bandwidth and the data transference technology is only ever going to get better.
Yeah. And actually, that brings you on to the next question, which is going to be, I may be wrong, but this feels like it's a relatively young sector. And I'm compared to the rest of the maritime industry. So I'm guessing it's still quite fast moving when you've just mentioned there's some sort of technology improvements. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the advent of the remote operations, albeit the idea has been around for a while. There's a Norwegian company, IKM, that has had remote operations centers for quite a few years, and they've had a resident vehicle sitting underwater for, most of the year, and it's controlled from the beach. Now, with that being on a platform, obviously platforms still have links to the beach. They'll have underwater cables and connections and whatnot. So, that could be, that's why they've been able to do it for years, because they've got that wired link. But yeah, the kind of advent of the full remote operations for ROVs is kind of been ramping up over the last kind of couple of years. It's been, a dream of a few companies and a few clients of ours, but now it's starting to see fruition where they're actually doing proper operations with not so much the bigger vehicles, but some of the smaller ones for survey-based operations. And then you've got the likes of one of my clients has just kind of bought new ROVs, and they're now implementing a full remote control center with a plan of going fully remote in the next kind of 2 years, which it's doable. But with, as I say, with all the new technology coming in and, Mr. Musk's Starlink providing a lot of the kind of bandwidth for it, it's going to be increasing over the next kind of couple of years.
Okay. And in terms of volume as a sector, I mean, I'm guessing at the moment, even though we've got all these companies out there doing this, it's still relatively, in terms of water space management, relatively uncongested. And so, in fact, I'm quite interested to know, do these companies operate in isolation, or is there some sort of industry body or some sort of mechanism, a bit like air traffic control, where you can like book water space to stop any incidents? Or
I don't know if there's that thing like air traffic control, but with regards to the kind of where they're working, so if they're working within an oil field, they're obviously, the people who own the oil field need to know that they're there and they're operating. So, they'll be working a permit to work system, and will be in place between the clients and obviously the end clients to make sure that they can be in there operating. And then if there are people operating in the same area, you have your SimOps procedures that are in place to ensure that, there's areas that you can't be going into, kind of restriction areas, similar to the platforms that are in the North Sea or anywhere where you've got that 500 meter exclusion zone. So depending on what the work. So with regards to like the UXO bits and pieces that I've done in the past, if we're actually actively searching for a UXO, there's a restriction limit around that vehicle. And if we're actually going in on a known UXO, that limit's increased. And if we're doing demolitions, which I've done in the past, that limit's increased even more so. And then there's safety procedures in place. But yeah, there's not a reporting body like air traffic control at all. It's all done on, whoever owns the field or the assets that are subsea at that point. And then a permit to work system would be in place.
Okay, so that's the offshore. But if you're doing, I guess some of this work is also being done for scientific endeavour and other surveys where, in probably open water. And so I suppose NOTAMs are just general sort of verification systems are used at present. There's nothing specialised, is what I'm hearing.
No, there's nothing specialised.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. And in terms of, you just mentioned all of safety there, that's a great sort of segue into, let's talk a little bit about the safety side of things. So what are the risks, what are the hazards, apart from being cold, wet and miserable in the North Sea, which we've all done, what are the big issues?
Big issues with regards to ROVs. So you've got just to do with the ROV itself and working on it, you've got your high voltage. So, you've got your your high voltage deck cables, going into the ROVs, you've got your 3.5, 4,000 volts when that's turned on, towards your HPU, your hydraulic power unit. And then you've got your hydraulics, your high pressure hydraulics. You've got the size of the system, the weight of it, swinging loads. And then you've got your launch system, which is mainly hydraulics, the movement of that, crush, pinch points. Plus you're on deck, as well as your standard kind of, on deck slips, trips, falls, dropped items. It's pretty much anything you can imagine. And any kind of health and safety situation is pretty much applicable to ROV while you're on deck. Once you're subsea, you then got entanglement, you've got, your tides, the sea itself. And, you then got to look into kind of loss of comms, loss of power to your ROV, where that is. And, God forbid, you actually lose the ROV, something's happened and it's broken away from its tether. You've then got your lost ROV and everything. So yeah, the hazards to do with ROVs, it might be seen as this kind of like glamorous lifestyle where you get to fly around the world and, you get to see these crystal clear waters and all that stuff. But invariably what you're working in is you've got no visibility. You can't see what you're doing and you're trying to operate on an asset, which, is potentially dangerous. There might be something that you might snag and break and something might happen. So yeah, it's quite a hazardous situation. The sitting on and piloting, that's the nice bit, sitting, being nice and warm and cozy with a coffee. But invariably you're working in stressful areas. You're working at height. There's nothing worse than being clamped onto the side of a launch system in the driving rain, trying to fix something in the cold. And,
you're not selling it to me.
No, but the thing is though, that when it comes to kind of working in an ROV, the glamorous side of it, it's great. I've been to Mexico, I've been to the Panama Canal, I've been to Canada, I've been, down at 6,000 meters, seen bits and pieces that people have never seen before, so,
really?
There are a lot of nice things to be done, but, if you're not willing to kind of take the rough for the smooth, and the rough tends to be, probably 70% of the job. The 30% when it's good, it's great, it cancels out all that rubbish beforehand, but we've all been there underneath an ROV trying to fix an oil leak, and you've just pulled it out of the water as well, so that it's dripping down on you, and you're getting all wet, cold, trying to plug an oil leak, trying to find where it's leaking from, and that's not great.
No, that's the less glamorous side of life, isn't it? I think it is interesting because it's a bit of myth busting, isn't it? Because I think I'd imagined it was a nice dry job, sitting in a nice warm place on the ship, and hadn't really thought about all the actual practical operations of it. Bit more myth busting. People say that, remote operated vehicles and unmanned vessels that we were talking about could take jobs away. That you've already been touching on the point that you need a lot of different people to run these operations. It doesn't really reduce the numbers.
I mean, there might be some reduction in the future, but I can't see it anytime soon because the technology for the remote operations is still relatively new. There still needs to be maintenance done on the ROV. So with the ROVs, you've got your maintenance schedule of your dailies, your weeklies, your monthlies, and et cetera, et cetera. They still need to be done. And those basic things are your basic checks to ensure that everything's going well. So like on a big world-class system, you'll have oil-filled compensators, which is to stop, basically, if there is a leak, to stop the oil from going into the electrics. So if you do have a leak, the oil will flow out of the compensator. So it hopefully gives you enough time to get that back on deck to then fix whatever's going on, and there's no water going into the electrics. So the checks of all that, and then the filling up of any comps which might have dropped down, that still needs to be done by a person at the moment. That there will be at a point where, they will have a plug-in system on deck where some little arm will come in and clag on and top up that oil. But until that point, you still need somebody, and, a cable breaks, it still needs to be repaired. So at the moment, on a full work-class system, you'd have 6 guys offshore, 3 per 12-hour shift. That might reduce to where you might just have a couple of guys offshore on call to do any fixing or maintenance, and then you'll have your onshore team of a couple of pilots. But, you're not going to have one pilot sitting there for 12 hours doing operations. He'd need to be, kind of swapped out. So whether you then got 2 or 3 guys onshore, so you're still looking, 5 guys potentially, maybe even 6 guys still. It's just that the offshore element might reduce, the onshore element will still be there.
Yeah, good myth busting. And I hear that astronauts train using some of these remote operated vehicles because it's similar to what you might have to do in space. Have you ever trained an astronaut, Andy?
No, can't say I have.
Should we give
there's been a few space cadets I've worked with, but I've never worked with any astronauts.
Okay, well, but we can maybe pass your number to Tim Peake if he's looking for a refresher course, maybe.
Yeah, of course.
That's a good point. I mean, what I'm about putting you on the spot. Sure, I think it's like a bit. Sort of, you should describe one of the more interesting jobs you've done, or something that's been particularly challenging.
Particularly challenging. I mean, I did a job not long after I started offshore where we had to recover a small airplane that had kind of taken off from an airport in the Caribbean. So again, one of the kind of glamorous side of it being in the Caribbean. However, the way that the plane landed, I think the pilot landed it in a way to kind of save the passengers. However, he it didn't do any favors for himself. So we had to go and recover it. And there's obviously remains still in the plane. So coming upon that, we had to find it via sonar. So as we're coming down, the sonar picked it up and it was just, crystal clear waters. The visibility couldn't be any better. And we saw the outline of the plane on the sonars were coming in. And then, we did a survey about it. But with me being a relatively newer member of the team, the kind of older and boulders did the full survey around it just so that we couldn't see what was going on inside because he'd been down there a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
So we then had to kind of connect that up and then bring that back to deck to be taken back alongside. So yeah, that's been one of the kind of interesting ones that we've done, and I've not been fortunate enough to see any kind of decent sea life. I keep on getting sent videos and all that from my friends of big manta rays and big whales and all that sort of stuff. And yeah, I've seen a Dumbo octopus. I think that's probably the only interesting one I've seen.
Megalodons.
No, unfortunately, no. Yeah, no megalodons that I've seen.
You had to discover something, have it named after you. There was no sea out there.
Yes.
A Harriarchus or something,
Yes, the Andy fish. Yeah, no, unfortunately, no.
There's plenty of time for that.
Yeah, well, I don't go offshore anymore, so there's no for me. But hopefully one of my contractors sees something and they call it like a pioneer shark or something like that.
Yeah,
that'd be
like
good.
That.
Yeah.
And what about, looking at the future, is there anything that you could, if you had a chance to change anything in the industry, anything you might consider changing to improve safety? Any thoughts?
I mean, with offshore safety, ever since, kind of Piper Alpha, the kind of safety's been, kind of fairly paramount. And, everybody always says that the worst saying in the offshore industry is that's the way it's always been, or that's the way it's always been done. And, there are a lot of, kind of changes that have happened over the years. The biggest thing that, I'd like to change is new people into the industry. It's a fresh pair of eyes coming into industry. They may be coming from a completely different kind of industry. They might be coming from car manufacturing or, working on diggers or, kind of heavy lift stuff. Coming into the RV industry is a fresh pair of eyes, but there's always that fear of speaking out.
Yeah.
Because, there's lessons learned from every project in the offshore industry, that there's always something that could have been changed or is changed or amended during a project because they found somewhere to do it better. But sometimes there's a way of doing it better, but somebody sees it and they don't speak up because they're new. There's always that fear of being shot down, even though it's always said in every kind of project, everybody has the capability to stop a job. That there's no voice that isn't important offshore. However, when you've got some of these like kind of old and bold guys that have been offshore for, 30 years and they're kind of like gruff and miserable, as a lot of seafarers that have been offshore for years are, they're not always approachable, even though, they usually are, and they're always, willing to listen, but there's always that fear of speaking out.
Yeah.
And I think that I don't know how that could be changed or, encouraged for people to speak out because, there is always that fear, but that would be probably one of the biggest things that I'd like to see change.
And one of the biggest things we see, people don't speak out for fear of ridicule or criticism or rejection. The two R's. And you're right, we've all been there. And I imagine like most offshore industries or most seafaring industries, they don't know about it. And so there is probably a lot of people that think, oh, I'm not sure that's right, but he must be right. She's done it for 30 years.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. And, they try to kind of go, well, they've got a lot more experience than me. They must know what they're doing. I won't pipe up. But, it's just proving that, there is no such thing as a kind of a stupid question or a stupid comment. If it's something that you're thinking about, you speak it out. If you get a bit of ridicule because, that's already been factored in, or, you've missed something which actually, you're picking this up, but actually we've already sorted that, it's in place, or you've missed it. But own that ridicule, because you might end up saying something which could, in theory, a week down the line, either save somebody's life or improve the efficiency of a project and all that. So yeah, all I would say is if you've got something at the back of your mind, speak up or speak to somebody. If you don't want to do it in front of everybody, speak to somebody. And they might just go, don't be daft. Or they might go, actually, that's a good idea. I'm going to steal that and I'm going to push that up the way.
That's good. Open reporting culture. Everybody could learn from somebody else's mistake, couldn't they? So, yeah. And obviously, Adam, you do get reports at Chirp, don't you, across the offshore and diving world?
In fact, I was saying to you the other day, we got one very recently from commercial divers. And actually, it made me realise that we don't really advertise ourselves enough to that sector because we talk about seafarers. And I suppose, and a good question actually why you're here, Andy, is would an ROV approach or an ROV team see himself as a seafarer or they're clearly a maritime worker, but...
Yeah, this is a bit of a grey area. I did a little bit of research on this before. So if you speak to any ROV guy, yes, they class themselves as seafarers. They're working on a ship. They might not be pivotal to the operation of the ship, but the main reason the ship's there is because they're working for the ROV.
Yeah.
However, if you look at the MCA guidelines, they don't necessarily consider the ROV team to be part of to be seafarers because they're not pivotal to the operation of the ship. They're not part of the main navigational team that operate the ship. They're specialized technicians, part of project group.
We're almost embarked contractors, aren't they?
Yes.
Which has a slightly different nuance again, but yeah.
Yeah. So and the way I see it is if you're working on a ship, regardless of whether you're kind of working within navigation or the power or the operation of the ship, but if you're working on that ship on a seagoing project, as far as I'm concerned, I would say you're a seafarer. But it is a massive grey area.
It is a grey area because the Maritime Labour Convention, I think he's got a phrase in there, and off the top of my head, is something like whose ordinary place of work is on board. And of course, you can be, how do you define on board? Are you talking about that particular vessel or a range of vessels? Because in aggregate, you could spend quite a lot of your time at sea.
Yeah.
Yes, but actually you're only spending potentially relatively short periods on any one vessel. Because you're quite a migratory sort of cohort of people, aren't you?
Yeah, there'll be people that'll be lucky enough to return to the same vessel, every 4 months, and and they'll be in the same rotation as the marine crew that are on board. However, you've got other people who just, they are, they take a contract, they're ad hoc workers, and they just go where the work is. So they could be on 5 or 6 different vessels in that year, but they could still spend 220 days offshore.
Yeah. Blimey.
That's interesting. Yeah, bit of a grey-blue area.
Very much so.
Interesting. Oh, this has been really interesting, Andy, and I'm sure loads of our listeners and viewers will find it a really interesting little glimpse into a world under the surface that really very few people see or know about. So, yeah, I'm really pleased you shared that with us. Thank you, Andy.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thank you.
Lovely. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll leave the bridge now in our careful and measured way. And thanks very much for joining us.
I'm grateful that we could got here. For me.